Bart's New Friend is the 11th episode of the 26th season of The Simpsons. This is directed by Bob Anderson, and I quite enjoyed this one. Part of it very much reminds me of the film Big, which is a delightful film with a wonderful performance by Robin Williams. And here we have a wonderful performance by Homer, and it is a performance, but not one he can control, because he ends up being hypnotized, and this hypnotist makes him think he's 10 years old. And there's actually a deeper layer to this, and I'll talk about that in a moment. And I think giving it that deeper layer and providing some really interesting food for thought about Homer and his work meant that this was a much more interesting episode. Having said that, if you just want to enjoy it on the surface level, I think there's still a lot that it offers because Homer starts to act like a young boy, and we see him sharing a bed with Bart and going to school, and it's just a really interesting look at Homer in a different way. Obviously, different characters have different responses to this. Marge is devastated, Lisa's confused. Bart's really happy because, and as Bart says at one point, he's like the brother he never has. And it's so sweet to see Homer and Bart being on the same wavelength and understanding one another and really connecting. And I think that's something that works really well in this episode. Visually, it's really cool as well. Homer is basically dressed like Bart at one point, which I rather enjoyed. And then, of course, there's the question of will he ever snap out of it? And I think it's quite unpredictable with how it ultimately ends up. But I think it's really well done, really moving, and a lot of fun. But as well as being fun, it's very thought provoking. And there are two ways of looking at this or analysing this. The first is the relationship between father and son, and the son was only really able to connect with the father when the father was able to see the world through his eyes. And I think that that's really important because it's not really possible to ask children to see the world through an adult's eyes, but it's very possible to ask an adult to look at the world through a child's eyes and see things from their perspective because they've been there before. They know what it's like. And I think it's a really good message that says if you just take the time to look at the world through your child's eyes, that's not to say you should share a bed with them and go to their school. Quite frankly, you shouldn't do that. But to take the time to not necessarily be the brother or sister they never had, but to be there for them in ways that they might need you, as well as being there as a parent, I think is something that can be really beneficial. And this helps to show that when Homer was able to do that, he was able to connect with Bart a lot more. Of course, it's much more of a balancing act. No parent should only ever act like their child's best friend. It's a balancing act of being, the parent and the friend. But in this case, we get to see Homer as the friend, as the brother, and I thought it was very sweet. The other way of looking at this, of course, is Homer's mental response to work-based stress. Now, Homer is faced with doing his job, quite frankly. It turns out we learn at the beginning that there were two safety inspectors, and all of this time the other person's been carrying his weight. But now the safety inspector is retired. It's on Homer's shoulders. He has to actually step up and do the job. And one could argue that the hypnotist didn't really hypnotize Homer. It was his brain looking for an excuse, looking for an out, a reason to escape the current situation and run away from it by basically buying into this hypnotism and finding a way to flee and fleeing into the role of a 10-year-old boy. And I think it's a very brief, I guess, but interesting look at how one's mental health can be impacted by workplace stresses. Obviously, just the requirement alone to do your job shouldn't be enough stress for somebody to revert back to being 10 years old, but certainly these things are possible. Maybe not quite in the extreme as this, but regression when you're faced with difficulties as an adult is not uncommon, and I think it does a good job of perhaps alluding to that. Not so much as it looks at the whole father-son thing, at least in my opinion, that's my reading of it. But there's a lot going on in this episode, a lot can be taken from it. But as I said, even if you did just choose to enjoy it on the surface level of a fun story about Homer being hypnotized, that's fine too. Personally, I like to dig a little bit deeper into it, and I enjoyed it. I thought it was definitely a really good episode, one I think I'll get more out of the more I watch it. And maybe my viewing experience will be different depending on where I'm coming from at the time and what I'm looking at to analyse in the episode. But for now, Bart's New Friend was one that I definitely got a lot out of. I thought it was very well done, and I absolutely recommend it.